So without further ado, let us work on our free motion quilting and ruler work designs. So get out your straight and curved ruler and your purple water-soluble marking pen. We're gonna get this party started. All right, just gonna leave that design up there so that it can remind me. And what I'm going to do first is to stitch down the perimeter of my design. So I'm going to start at the side, tack down my threads. So I've just pulled up my bobbin thread, which is hard to see because it's a white thread. And I'm going to stitch ever so slightly on either side of that hole to create the smallest knot that I can. Now if you pull up your needle and you pull on either one of your threads and they still move, your thread is not knotted. So you need to put in another tack or two, okay? I'm going to line up my ruler with my hopping foot. My needle is right into where my blue line should be, okay? And if you'll notice, it's hard to tell from here, but as I stitch a bit, you'll be able to see my ruler has to be 1/4 of an inch away from the line that I'm stitching on because my needle is protected by my hopping foot, and that's 1/4 inch away from my ruler. See how that line is 1/4 of an inch away? You stitch to where you feel comfortable, stop with your needle in the down position, and then continue forward. This is the same for sit down or stand up quilters when you're working with rulers. Your power position with a ruler is right over where the handle is or wherever your hand lays if your hand is flat. And once you get past that part, you're going to have to stop and reposition. So you can have some 12 and 16 inch rulers, but that doesn't make them any easier or better for you to use. Now I know I was talking earlier about tensions and how directionally left is harder on your thread because of needle flex going from right to left. I think it's impossible to find a thread path that would have your machine stitching in the proper direction every single time. But you just need to be aware of what's happening with your machine, and if you get good stitches, great. If they get messed up, then you may need to adjust. There is lots of thunder and lightning happening. Now if you notice, I'm getting the full 14 inches wide of my placemat in here. If you have a smaller throat than I do, or more clearance with your frame, you might find that you cannot get the entire 14-inch stitching on your machine in your stitching space. So that might be something that you're going to have to roll back and forth and complete a piece at a time. And it's totally doable on smaller machines. Now, I've got my perimeter stitch, which is fantastic. Keep in mind, we aren't necessarily stitching these lines here, okay? Nor are we necessarily stitching this line right here. We will actually stitch our cornerstones and in between our arches. So you have one of two options. One, you can backtrack and get down in there and try to get portions of that design done while you're working on it. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tack off my threads. Actually, I'm not. Just keep in mind, the more you backtrack over what you stitch, the more prominent it's going to be, which is no big deal on the edge because you're probably going to cover that with binding. But right in here, You're gonna wanna be on point. So I knew I was gonna backtrack that line so I could get this inside line, so it's best to just not move your ruler, stitch forward and stitch back. We're just getting our 1 inch marking lines in there. Once you get to your previous stitch line, stop, backtrack to the outside. So that's keeping a majority of the backtrack lines on the outside. So why don't we go around and do all 4 corners? Sometimes you got to make up your stitching path as you go. It's not always clear to you right away. And when I stitched my first one, my stitching path was completely different than this one. So at the very least, this one will be a little bit better than what the last video would have looked like. I had already filmed my first sample. I had filmed it so I could edit it and put it into video form for you guys. But I wasn't paying attention to the setting on my camera and I missed a whole lot of it. So now I'm stitching it again, but that's okay because you can see a good bit better on this cream than you could on the other one. Now, if you don't want to worry about following ruler lines to get to your next one, don't. Just go along the outside, pack that side down. So I'm stitching real close to my border line, because what I could do is at the very end, I could cut about 1/4 of an inch off of this line and use this as where my binding's gonna be so that nothing really gets in the way of the whole design. But I'm packing down my puffy batting so that it's not a pain in the butt to bind around because it's so fluffy. Another way I like to combat that is to go around the edge with a zigzag stitch or to use my serger. And my serger is my friend when it comes to binding. So touch that line, come back down. Stop. So that's the bonus of having those lines pre-drawn. So let's say I didn't want to pre-draw those and I wanted to just stitch them down using my ruler. What we're going to do is utilize our ruler. Now our ruler has 1/2 inch and 1 inch marking lines horizontally, and well, whichever way you're looking at it, horizontal or vertical, right? So those are vertical, I guess. And then it's got 1/4 inch lines on the vertical, and it tells you that it's sitting at 1/2 inch, 3/4, 1 inch, or 1 1/4 inch. So you're going to utilize that 1 inch line. If yours doesn't have markings for the 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, 1 inch, okay, then you're going to count 1, 2, 3 lines. You're going to take a piece of that glow line tape, right? And you're going to put it 1, 2 on the 3rd line, and that's going to be the line that you line up to get your 1 inch. On the flip side of that, if you just wanted to stitch 1 inch down, you line up one of your inch lines. So I'm going to line up number 6 with my blue outer line, and that's number 5. And I'm going to stitch until I get down to my needle being in number 4. So I use this as a way to gauge actually stitching down 1 inch. Didn't have to really measure anything to get down to that line. Then I line up my ruler so that that 1 inch line is on that blue outside line. And what that is each one of these lines is 1/4 of an inch. So that's 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch. But if you add those 3/4 plus this extra 1/4 where your needle comes out, that gives you 1 full inch. Then, if this blue line weren't here and I wanted to stop stitching at 1 inch away, again, you line up one of those inch lines with your outer edge and you stop stitching 1 inch from the edge. So I'll stitch until I get to 5. My needle's in 5, and then I'll put my ruler down, line up that 3rd line with my outer blue line, and I'll stitch down. So that's a good way that you can use your ruler to measure without having to worry about drawing a whole bunch of lines on the quilt top. So next, just because I wanted to complete that line, we are going to start stitching our arch design. So we came back to the middle, and again, this is not a line that we're actually stitching down, and we'll worry about the border when we get to it. We want to do our arch. Now our arch is sitting a good 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's a good inch from the outside. So again, you can use your ruler, line it up with 4 lines. So if you're looking at the ruler, you're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. That's an inch until that 1, 2, 3, 4th line. So if you line up that 4th line on your blue line, draw a purple line. That's where you know that you can, that's where the tip of your arch is going to go. Aside from that, you want to also mark the middle of that purple line because that's where your arch is going to hit. So we're going to do 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches, because these are 3-inch wide blocks. So we're going to mark the half point at 1.5 inches. So we have those 2 blocks ready to quilt. Sometimes it's easier not to mark everything in blue because your brain has a lot to think about. So we're going to put down our ruler, okay, and our ruler is 1/4 inch from the corner, and we're going to stitch to this next corner, okay, up to this point and then down to this corner. So it's 1/4 inch from this corner, and then you guessed it, it's 1/4 inch eyeballed from this purple dot. So let's see what that looks like. Stop when you land on the purple dot. And then you line it up so that it's the 1/4 inch from a purple dot and the 1/4 inch from where the edge of this ruler is from the corner of that block. Okay, and remember we have 1, 2, 3, 4 total arch lines. So what we're going to do next, again, we're utilizing our ruler lines. We're going to utilize these white lines on the inside to gauge how big we want our space to be. So if we line up this arch line with our first arch line at the very tippy top point, because that's an easy point to reference, it's going to give you roughly 1/2 inch from the tip of this to the tip of the next one. And actually, if we were smart, we would have drawn a line all the way down because we are making more than one arch. So actually, we want to divide this block all the way. We want to see that middle line. So we're going to line up the first point with the arch tip. We're going to use the inside arch of our ruler. We're going to stitch until we reach the purple line. Oh, and I wanted to say too, if your ruler is sliding around a lot, you might want to get some ruler grip. Hear this stuff? It's like sandpaper. This is like grip tape that my brothers used to put on their skateboards when we were little, and it's clear. It's called Handy Grip. Again, you can get that on the website if you need it, but it's great because it really holds that ruler in place. The only thing I will say is that this, when it catches on the batting, will get little fuzz balls of batting on your quilt top that you could accidentally stitch into your quilt top. The other con about it is that if you put this on a satin or sateen type fabric, it could make a bit of a run. So you may want to get rubber grips for the bottom if you're going to work with sateen fabric, but the rubber grips, as you rub your ruler around, they actually roll off and lose their stickiness. So I'm not a big fan of the rubber style grips. So we got this lined up with our ruler. our needle's a 1/4 inch away. It's a 1/4 inch away from this pocket. We're stitching it right, it's gonna join the next one. Okay, the second line that we stitch, okay, that one is gonna go to line 2. So we're gonna line up line 2 with the tip of our previous arch, and this is gonna give us enough space to stitch some pretty pebbles in there. We're gonna widen up that arch a bit. Stop at the purple line, come down, line it up a 1/4 inch away from there. Don't worry, I won't go this slow the entire way. So then we're gonna go, this was 1 line down, then 2 lines, then back to 1 line. So we're just lining up that etched 1/4 inch line with the tip of our previously stitched arch. Put that in there. Last one. Bam, 1 arch done. I hope you feel proud of yourself because that is awesome. I particularly love this shape. So now we need to continue to progress, because even if we did this over here, because this is where we are, when we finish that arch, if we don't put pebbles in here, it's gonna end up right in this point, and then you're doing backtracking, which you don't want to have to do if you don't have to do it. So we fix that by putting pebbles or a back and forth design of some kind in here, okay? So let's do a pebble design. So I traveled a little bit up my arch to give me enough space to actually fit a pebble in there. So now I see I'm getting to a point where I could put another pebble next to it, but then nothing's gonna be in my tip. I like to have a pebble in my tip, so I'm just gonna fill that in. Okay, and then when I get to a spot where I really can't fit another pebble in, I'm just gonna ride that arch line out and then call it done. So you can see there's a little bit of space between this pebble and the edge where I didn't quilt a pebble, which I could if I put this into non-regulated mode and let it stitch itself. I can get really smooth, fine pebbles, but that can be difficult with the hologram thread, and I didn't test that in my tension test, so I'm not gonna do it. So we're 1 inch away from the edge, and then we need 1.5 inches in, because that's half of our block, okay? So this line is where our arches will meet. This crosshair is where the tip of our arch will go. So I'll walk you through this one more time, and then I will probably speed everything up. 1/4 inch away from our crosshair. 1/4 inch away from our corner. One line from the tip to the middle. And 1/4 inch away from that arch. 2 lines, 2 etched lines in from that top arch, just resting on the top of that arch. Till we get to the purple middle. Then we do it till it's 1/4 of the way out. Then it's 1 line, 1/4 inch. We're going to travel up that arch just a little bit to give us enough space to get a pebble in there. Okay, now if your threads matched, you wouldn't see all the little lumps and bumps where my lines don't perfectly go over my pebbles. So if your thread blends, then you won't see all those lumps and bumps, but if it doesn't blend, then you are seeing all of your areas for improvement. Next, and this is where This ruler is just barely doing the trick. We're going to do a double arch design in here. So we're going to line it up with our needle, and we're going to put it 1/4 of an inch from this tip in this front corner. So when we stitch, it should meld nicely with the design. And then line it up with the needle, and 1/4 of an inch from the bottom. Okay. And then we're just gonna mark a 1-inch line where we want that next arch to hit. And if we just mark a, 45, we get a good cross point for that tip to hit. So we'll line it up so it's 1/4 of an inch from my cross point. And 1/4 of an inch from the outside. So now you have your little filler area. I would say now, if you were going to put any kind of filler in this part of the petal, which you totally could, it would look very neat in this area, now would be the time to do that, get it in and get it out, okay? You could also fill this space now if you'd like, to prevent having to backtrack up in here going forward, so you don't have a ton of thread capturing in here. But I want to save the free motion stuff really for the end if I can help it. Let's stick to the same designs. So you're going to take your ruler, you're going to mark your 1-inch line, you really could just worry about one block at a time, because if you're like me and you live in a humid climate, that those lines are going to go away pretty quickly. This line's already going away. Got my cross point. I'm going to do my next set of arches. So I'm going to work my way all the way around. You notice I don't have any issue changing hands. That's partly because I've got practice with my rulers, switching hands, and partly because I have a machine that allows me to have both handles be my go button for stitching. So we're just lining up, this top line with the top of our arch. Okay, and then we're just going to travel up a little ways until we can make a pebble. I do want to say one thing. Right here I made this boo-boo, right? And all I could think was, oh, that doesn't look pretty. So then that makes my next one look less pretty, and then my next one look less pretty. I'm like, okay, stop thinking about how pretty it doesn't look and keep going and stay on track. So don't have a conversation with yourself when you're stitching these like I did. Just try to get them stitched and do the best that you can. See, these lines are already gone. Which is great, because when I'm done quilting, I don't have to worry about looking at them. did that right. That line should match up perfectly with your hexagon. If you notice, from time to time I slide my ruler a little bit. That's because I'm not quite meeting the area where I should be. And I visually want it to finish up right in that curve. So I adjust. I go with the flow, so to speak. right, so now I'm going to do my border. I have put my glow line tape at the 3/4 inch marking because that's how big, that's exactly half, right? So we're gonna do, we got our border line, we've got our halfway mark, then we've got the tip of our arch, then the halfway mark, then our border line. So this is what's going to divide this space evenly in half. So half of 1.5 inches is 3/4 inches. So we're gonna line up our ruler. I just broke my thread and started over here because I like to push around the quilt top. I didn't want to go backwards and use my wrong hand because I'm right-handed. So I like to hold with my left hand and move with my right. If you are left-handed, you don't want to use your wrong hand. You want to guide with your left and push around with your right. So you'll probably want to go counterclockwise, but I like to go clockwise because I am right-handed. I'm going to line up that second line that my glow tape is marking up with the stitched line that I made from earlier. Back my ruler up to that. It's nice and straight, so I'm going to stitch down to my arch, touch, come back, travel along the ditch. Now the most important thing, whether it is the proper spacing or not, I know y'all don't want to hear that, but aesthetically, you want to get that needle to hit the tip of that arch. And right now, that is showing me a little bit past 3/4 inch. So adjust your ruler if you have to. Poop. But it'll look wrong if you don't. Stitch that one just right. Touch your arch and back. So you can see, I messed up a little bit there, but we're not going to worry about it. You can see that this one is a little smaller than this one, and this one is a little bit bigger than this one, and this one is a little bit smaller than this one. That's because my arch went a little past the middle when I marked it, and it's more important to get that in line with the tip of the arch than it is to get your spacing correct. Because aesthetically your eye is going to see it not matching with the tip of the arch, which it doesn't match perfectly. This one might be spot on. Touch and go. That one is a little big, but you shouldn't have to do another one after that one. Now you'll see me traveling along the outside a lot. The reason for that is I could just as easily have traveled down here and back up here, but I don't want to make these lines any thicker than I really need to make them, and because they're already stitched, what that does is that has a greater chance for me not stitching my threads properly where I'm going. So we're doing 3/4 inch touch and back, 3/4 inch touch, back, 3/4 inch touch, back. So we're touching the arch and coming back. Alright, I fixed that thread break. We're going to keep going around. For some reason, my bobbin thread keeps winding around the shaft of my bobbin case. So this was the direction I was trying to avoid going. Actually, that's a lie. Again, I like to work left to right. So instead of using the wrong hand to go this way, I'm going to bypass this area. Again, I like to stitch close to the edge, but not on my outer edge line, largely because it'll push down that batting, and when I am binding, it will be easier to bind. Haha, and we are finished with the border. The fact that I had to cut that string without it breaking was amazing. Okay, y'all getting a good view of what this border is looking like so far? We have almost the entire outer edge of our quilt done, with the exception of having to fill in these spaces when we go through to free motion quilt. Okay, so when we come back on our next video, we're going to fill the inside of the design, starting with the hexagon. We'll get ready for that, and I'll meet you there.